Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be continuing our look at the presidency of Andrew Jackson, once again focusing on, as I mentioned last time, Jackson's presidency through the lens of a few things, including how he responds, how he reacted, his solutions, actions, whatever you want to say, in some of the major crises of his presidency. Last time we talked about how he handled Native American removal with the Indian Removal Act. And today we're going to look at two other major crises that occurred during his presidency, one having to do with the National Bank and the other having to do with that theory of nullification or doctrine of nullification that we've looked at in the past. Once again, all these are going to be very, very different problems, and also very different from the one we looked at last time with Native American issues and Native American removal. Ultimately, what we can see in all of these is a conflict between state governments and national government, and a conflict between state power and national, or if you want to look at it the way Jackson likely sees it, is presidential power. Because the thing about Jackson, one of the things that makes his presidency really transformative and really significant, is not just the whole common man president and the idea that the common man could be president and that someone could be a self-made person and didn't necessarily have to be born into wealth and all those things. Jackson's presidency represents very much an enhancement in the power of the presidency, an enhancement in the power of the president himself. Jackson believes, and we see in his actions that he believed, that the president should be a leader, that the president was meant to act, that the president was not just like a pawn of Congress. They weren't just supposed to do what Congress told them to do, that the president also had the ability to act on their own conscience and to do what they thought was best and to be the decider. So we're going to see him do that actually in a couple of these situations. So the first of these major crises we want to look at today is something that is known as the Nullification Crisis. And this goes back actually to, of course, that theory of nullification or that doctrine of nullification that we looked at in the past. And so just to refresh your memory, this was an idea, the whole doctrine of nullification was that idea that states had the power to nullify laws. So let's take a look at where this come from. So this is kind of a rehash, a refresh. These are some things that we actually have talked about in the past. So the origins of this crisis, we need to understand where both of these sides are coming from in the nullification crisis. Those that are going to support the concept of nullification and say that states do have this power, and then those that do not and say that the theory of nullification is flawed, wrong, impossible, illegal, so forth and so on. So supporters of nullification, their theory of nullification or doctrine of nullification, again, this was the idea that states could nullify federal laws, that the states existed first. This came from those Virginia and Kentucky resolutions where they argued that that whole compact theory idea that the states existed first, the states came first, and therefore the states had more power, that they had power over the federal government and could essentially choose not to follow laws of the federal government if they were unconstitutional. So sort of a different take on who gets to step in if the Congress or the president, I suppose, acts beyond their bounds. If they do something that is unconstitutional, these people would argue that it was the states that had the right to intervene there and actually block that action. Now, another thing that they based that on, yes, they were getting it from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that Madison and Jefferson had written back as far as 1799, but one of the places where those people got it from, where they based it off of, was the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights. This is one we didn't focus on too much when we looked at the Bill of Rights. We're going to look at it here. The 10th Amendment is also often called the States' Rights Amendment, or it is the basis of what's called the states' reserved powers, because this amendment says that any powers that were not granted to the national government are reserved for the states, essentially meaning that anything, or suggesting that any powers that they did not explicitly give to the national government, Congress shall have the power to do A, B, and C, whatever that is, that if they didn't list it there, then it's reserved for the states. So supporters of nullification and supporters of the entire states' rights argument would interpret that to mean that the national government could only do those things that the Constitution specifically stated, and everything else was left up to the states. So they based this off the 10th Amendment to say that states do have these kinds of powers. Now, let's look at the other side of things. Let's look at those that oppose nullification. So these are those who are going to say the theory of nullification is wrong. It's flawed. Those that came up with it were just absolutely incorrect. that states do not have this power, and that exercising such a power or attempting to invoke such a doctrine would not only be flawed, but be very, very dangerous and be quite problematic. So, some of the things that they say are where they base that off of. One that is constitutionally based in the supremacy clause, as some of you may have already guessed. So they argue that the states are not first, that the states don't come first. The states clearly do not have power over the federal government. They cannot decide not to abide by federal law. They cannot declare something unconstitutional because that supremacy clause says that the Constitution and therefore the federal government is the supreme law of the land. So they say that clearly, dispels any ideas or any fantasies, they might say, that the states somehow have power over the federal government. They would argue that this clearly means the federal government is over that of the state. So they use the supremacy clause to debate their side of things. They would even use the first three words of the Constitution to defend their argument that the federal government is more powerful, or rather in this case, really to argue against, to debunk the whole compact theory idea that your supporters of nullification argue. The first three words of the Constitution, of course, being "we the people." So in using this, they're arguing that the national government is not a creation of the states, it's a creation of the people, that it wasn't the states that gave it its power, it's not the states that created it, it was the people that did that. So the states are left out of it. So they say this whole concept of the fact that, Virginia existed before we wrote the Constitution, that is meaningless to the extent that it doesn't mean that the federal government is somehow weaker or gets its power from the states. This is not about states, it's about the people. The national government represents the people. And they would also argue that the United States was, in fact, a nation. And we've talked about that word a little bit in the past. Nation, remember, is a word that we use a lot, but it does mean something very, very specific. And some people would have been very careful not to use the word nation to describe the United States. But opponents of nullification, the nationalists, as you might say, support the idea the United States is a nation. And that means that it's one thing, that it is unified, that this is one government, this is one country, one nation, indivisible. It cannot be divided up. And therefore, states cannot just decide not to do something. We all function under this one Constitution. And so states don't have the ability to just decide which parts of that they want to abide by and which parts they can't. And they argue that this is dangerous, that if you allow states to just pick and choose which kind of laws or which laws they want to follow, then we won't have a nation. Then it will fall apart. What's the point of having a federal government if that federal government can be ignored and if that federal government is less than the states? So they think that is really important for just overall national unity, that nullification or anything remotely resembling it not be allowed. So that's the background to all of this. Now let's look at the actual nullification crisis. What happened? To make, essentially in a nutshell, what's going to happen here is a state is going to get angry about a law and try to nullify it. And so we're going to have a showdown between the federal government and President Jackson over that, and whether or not they're going to allow and support that state's nullification and let them get away with it, or are they going to try to stop them in some kind of a way. So the reason that this happens is because of tariffs. The nullification crisis all boils down to tariffs. Now remember that tariffs are taxes on imports, and tariffs had been risen significantly higher as part of the American system. And this was something, tariffs go back way, way, way back. This is a way for government to raise revenue. They were also meant, particularly those as part of the American system, were meant to encourage American business and encourage American manufacturing. It's about, raising the price of foreign imports to give American businesses, local businesses, more of an edge, to give them a foot in the door and eliminate, or not eliminate, but certainly weaken their foreign competition. Well, one thing that we have not mentioned yet, but we need to know, is that the South generally hates tariffs. Always have, always will. Very, very opposed to tariffs. The South hates them because the South, if you think about it this way, the tariffs, they're meant for revenue, but they're also meant to help out industry, to help out businesses. Well, where is the industry? Where is the business? It's in the North. So they see all this as just helping the North. This is a very one-sided policy that affects the North, that helps them at the expense of the South. The South, they argue, doesn't receive any benefit from tariffs. All they get is higher prices because this drives the prices up. And Southerners, not being industrialized and relying on manufactured goods from elsewhere, they would much rather have cheap imports than they would more expensive imports because of tariffs, or more expensive locally made products. So they do not like tariffs at all, and never will. So we're getting into also where some of these nationalistic policies like tariffs eventually start breeding more sectionalism, because they did tend to benefit certain parts of the country over others, and that's going to be the case with tariffs. So they argue this is all about the North. This is helping them at our expense. And also, if they're meant to encourage business and industry and development and all that kind of stuff, it's all pulling the country in a direction that the South doesn't want to go. It's pulling them away from this agricultural kind of economy that you had in the South. So they are always going to be very, very opposed to tariffs. They hate and despise them. One particular Southerner who particularly hates and despises tariffs and voices his concern over these and how damaging and harmful they are to the South is John C. Calhoun. Now, you may recall John C. Calhoun as a war hawk, and he started out his career as a war hawk. He's from South Carolina, of course, a Southern state. John C. Calhoun, though, is a very interesting example, and I don't mean this to sound negative about him, but he started out as a war hawk and a big nationalist, very much in there with Henry Clay as far as wanting strong national government. He was supportive in the early years of things like the American system, but as time goes on, he starts to feel and starts to believe and realize that those policies did not help his state, that they were actually harmful to his state. So John C. Calhoun eventually does like a total 180, where he starts his career really as a big nationalist, in favor of strong national government. He ends up becoming one of the staunchest leading supporters of states' rights, one of the greatest perpetuators of sectionalism. Again, not to say that he was just flip-flopping or doing what was popular. In his mind, he just saw, these things don't help my state, and so I want to stand up for things that do. So tariffs is one of those things, something he might have been in favor of many years before in the younger part of his career, but now he sees the tariffs as very harmful. So he writes this whole document called the Exposition and Protest, or the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, where he rails against the tariff. And this was published anonymously. We know how politicians in these days like to do. He didn't want his name attached to it, but he rails against the tariff and why this is harmful, arguing that this is very, very damaging to Southern economies and that it has the potential to destroy the South's economy, to destroy their whole way of life. Ultimately arguing that what this does is it makes slavery too expensive. If we have to pay all this money, all this extra money for manufactured goods, then we're not going to be able to afford slavery. Our whole labor system collapses, our whole economy collapses, our whole way of life collapses. So it's a really, really dramatic, explanation as to why these tariffs are so bad. And it's not just we don't like it, and it's very, very deep to say this will absolutely flat out destroy the South. And then he starts digging up those Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. He starts going into all that and starts going into the whole theory of nullification thing. This is what I meant several weeks ago when I said eventually somebody pulls that off the shelf, blows the dust off, and tries to go with it. And that's what John C. Calhoun is doing here. So he starts to go back to those things and, brings up this idea that we could nullify this, and suggesting that might be an option for Southern states to actually nullify these tariffs. And really what he's doing here, he actually expands on what Jefferson and Madison wrote in those Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Calhoun actually argues that states have the right to nullify things, not just if they're unconstitutional, but he says even if it's just harmful. Because tariffs, clearly the Congress has the power to tax. That's clearly an enumerated power, so you couldn't really argue that it's unconstitutional. But Calhoun argues that because it is harmful to the South, because it damages them, that they have the ability to actually nullify it. And he even outlines a procedure of how you would go about doing it. So he actually expands on that. So he puts all that out there. And then he even suggests this. like I said, he actually puts out a procedure for nullification. Basically says a state can call a convention, they can, or the legislature rather, can vote to nullify. And then the federal government's got a choice. The federal government can either accept that nullification and say, okay, fine, you're not going to have to obey the law, or in this case, pay the tariff. But if they don't accept nullification, then Calhoun argues that a state would have the right to secede. They have the right to secession. In other words, to leave. We talked about that a little bit earlier. So he is proposing that secession could be the next step if nullification is not accepted. So all this is put out, and it's causing quite a controversy. Again, one of those things that most people probably know that Calhoun wrote it, but he's not, officially attaching his name to it. And then things get a little bit more heated when, in 1832, another tariff is passed that is even higher. And at that time, the state of South Carolina decides to go through with what Calhoun was proposing. Once again, Calhoun is from South Carolina, so that's not surprising. And their legislature votes to nullify that 1832 tariff. So essentially what they are saying is that we are not enforcing this law. We are invoking the theory of nullification because this is harmful to us and harmful to our economy, and so we are not doing it. And so this is the nullification crisis. You have the state of South Carolina claiming to have nullified this tariff and saying that they are not going to enforce it. So clearly we have here a conflict between the federal government and the state government. A state saying we're not going to do this, a federal government saying, no, you don't have to. And also these questions over who has more power here. So this is what Jackson is faced with. And to make things more complicated and a little bit more tense, we should probably know that Calhoun, who we know is, he didn't nullify this, the state of South Carolina did, but you can see Calhoun there kind of whispering in people's ears and, nudging people in the side to do it. But Calhoun is also Jackson's vice president. So that makes all this just a little bit awkward and a little bit more tense. So Jackson has the difficult task of what does he do here? Does he let South Carolina get away with it? That could potentially show significant weakness. That could invite other states to do this. And then what are you going to have? But if he doesn't allow them, then are they going to secede? Is he going to use some kind of military force? Is this going to mean war even? Could violence break out? And we almost have civil war breaking out about 30 years too early over this. Jackson's solution is really quite clever. And, if you're uncertain on where Jackson stands on this, remember that Jackson believes very much in being a leader. And Jackson overall thinking here is no way does any state have a right to defy me and to defy the federal government, that they do not have this right. They do not have the ability to nullify federal laws like this. He absolutely disagrees with that, which is a little different than how he handled things in the Indian removal situation. There, he argued that the states could do what they wanted, but here he doesn't do that. So Jackson's solution is a little bit clever because he, doesn't want to cause a conflict, but at the same time, he doesn't want South Carolina to get away with disobeying the law. So he actually does two things, or rather, Congress does. Congress does two things at the same time, at Jackson's bequest. One is a law called the Force Bill is passed. What the Force Bill would do if it were used, or it basically just gives President Jackson the authority to actually send troops into South Carolina, not for the purpose of invading them or taking them over or attacking them, but for the purpose of enforcing the tariff. So it gives him the ability, the authorization to use force to make them pay the tariff and make sure those duties are actually collected. Now, if that could result in violence, maybe, but it's just authorizing him to use that force. But at the exact same time, Congress is also going to pass what it becomes known as the compromise tariff. And this is designed by Henry Clay once again. So it's another one of several compromises that Henry Clay is behind, or he is part of. The compromise tariff lowers the tariff. So it doesn't get rid of it, but it would lower it to pre-1832 rates. And the hope is that maybe South Carolina can better live with that. Now, these things are done at the same time. So Jackson basically offers both, and he puts the ball back in South Carolina's court. And supposedly he says, with one hand I offer you war, with the other hand I offer you peace, your plan to choose. So South Carolina decides, as you may guess, to go with the compromise tariff. South Carolina accepts the compromise tariff. The tariff is lowered, and crisis averted. So the nullification crisis does not result in secession. It does not result in war. South Carolina accepts the compromise. So, interestingly enough, with the nullification crisis, and you could get into a good debate or discussion about this, both sides claim to have won. Both sides feel that they are the winner in this whole showdown between the federal government and the state of South Carolina. The federal government and Jackson say we win because we got South Carolina to pay the tariff. We did not accept their nullification. We did not accept this concept. And we also prevented them from seceding. We kept the country together and asserted the power of the federal government. South Carolina, though, could also argue that they won because they did get a lower tariff. They did get the government to change its mind about something. So, in their mind, this does not in any way negate the whole idea of nullification. To them, it just proves that this is an acceptable and effective way to stand up for states' rights as they saw it. So, the significance of the nullification crisis, a few things. For one thing, this just shows how deep these sectional tensions really are. That this era of good feelings we had been in and this age of nationalism has given way to a great deal of sectionalism. That these tensions haven't really gone anywhere, and in fact, they have really been increased by some of those nationalistic policies. That we're seeing this rift, as the northern economy moves towards industrialization and urbanization, the southern economy is becoming more and more entrenched in agriculture and slavery. And so those differences, that sectional divide, is growing, and the nullification crisis is very much an illustration of that. It also, shows how deeply a lot of these states were willing to go in order to protect what they saw as states' rights, states like South Carolina. And it may not surprise you, and some of you already know that, and maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not, that when secession really does happen, South Carolina is the first one. So, they have not let go of these particular ideas. This also kind of shows us something a little bit about Jackson as a leader. Once again, I mentioned that Jackson believes in strong leadership. He believes that he is in charge. And this shows him, kind of taking charge of this particular situation and, saying states' rights, don't care about that. It's all about the power of the national government in this particular case. But we will not always see Jackson be in favor of national power. We saw that with Native American removal, actually. And we will lastly see that with the issue of the national bank and an incident or a crisis known as the Bank War. So obviously this involves the national bank, which, remember, has been a controversy ever since its inception in the 1790s. We saw it expire in the early 1800s. It was revived as part of the American system. It's been upheld by the Supreme Court in the McCullough versus Maryland decision, but this issue over the bank never seems to go away, or at least not in this particular era. So let's see what Jackson thinks of the bank and what he does. So once again, apologize, I got ahead of myself. The second bank of the United States, that is the National Bank, that had been rechartered as part of the American system and has been back in effect, but it has reignited some of those same issues, concerns about its constitutionality. Even though the Supreme Court has technically already ruled on that, we still have people arguing that it is unconstitutional. But there is also other differences about the bank and whether or not it is good or bad. So let's take a look at that. First of all, let's know that Jackson is very much opposed to the National Bank. He does not like the National Bank. It is very, very ironic that Andrew Jackson has for so long been on the $20 bill, because Jackson hated the concept of a federal bank. He hated the concept of paper money. It almost makes you wonder if that was done to kind of be a slap in the face to Jackson, although he is soon to be replaced by Harriet Tubman, which is kind of exciting. But anyway, Jackson very much opposes the National Bank. He does think it is unconstitutional, but that's not the main thing he says. Jackson believes the National Bank is too big and too powerful, that it is an overextension of federal power, that this is something that benefits the wealthy, that it's a very elitist institution, that the wealthy are the ones that profit off of it. He is bothered by the fact that, and this is complicated, but the National Bank was chartered by the federal government, but it's run by private investors and private citizens. So ultimately, that's who it answers to. And ultimately, at the end of the day, just like any other bank, it stands to turn a profit for its investors, which were wealthier individuals, Northeasterners, those kind of people, the folks that Jackson doesn't get his support from, the non-common man folk. And so Jackson argues that this is an elitist institution that benefits the wealthy and harms the small farmer, that this is damaging to the small farmer. It is damaging to the common man. It does not benefit them. It just perpetuates these class differences and economic inequality and those kind of things. He may not have articulated it in those words, but overall just sees this as way too big, too powerful, has too much control over the money, and it is not a common man institution. Now, you have others, of course, though, that support the bank, and we're going to characterize that by this person, Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the United States. So when this showdown over the national bank erupts, this bank war, it is often portrayed as a showdown between Andrew Jackson, who doesn't like the bank, and Nicholas Biddle, who supports the bank, obviously, because he's the president of the bank. But there are, of course, a lot of others that felt like him. Nicholas Biddle and others that supported the bank argue that the bank was important for the economy overall, that this kept the economy stable. They argue that this kind of cushioned those ups and downs that we've talked about. The economy always has this cycle of, growth and then retraction, or, recession, or whatever you want to call that, boom and bust, that all constantly is going up and down. And they argue that the national bank kind of makes that a little bit less drastic, because the national bank has some regulatory powers. This keeps, puts paper money out there when we need it, retracts it when we don't, that this provides capital. It provides, money, loans, credit that's good for the government, that's good for economic development. Some of those same things that Hamilton had been arguing back in the 1790s. So they argue that this is really important for economic growth. It's really important for economic stability. And it's needed to keep the country's finances and the economy, stable and kind of keep things in order. But Jackson, nevertheless, is very much opposed to the bank. So this whole thing starts, its so-called bank war erupts, when the bank bill is proposed. And what the bank bill would do is it would reauthorize the national bank, recharter it. So this is Congress deciding it's time to think about, it's like renewing a library book. We're going to renew the national bank. Now, they bring this up. Actually, it's Henry Clay, the big nationalist who loves the national bank. He's on Nicholas Biddle's side. They bring this bank bill up a little bit early. The bank's charter is not actually going to expire for several more years, but they decide to try to force the issue and make this a campaign issue to try to trap Jackson. So they bring it up early, make it something that Jackson's got a campaign on, thinking that that's going to hurt him in his campaign if he's railing against the national bank, that that's going to cost him a lot of support, so forth and so on. So there's all this controversy about what is Jackson going to do? Is he going to renew the national bank? They also don't think he's going to veto it, because at this point in time, the veto had not been used all that much. The perception of the veto in this moment, in this time in history, was that the veto was sort of like an emergencies only kind of a thing. It's like the fire extinguisher that's behind the glass case, that you only break it in case of absolute emergency. So the veto wasn't meant to be used just here, there, and everywhere. It was meant to be a truly, if Congress is doing something that is just really, really egregious, absolutely unconstitutional, that was when you got out the veto, and it had rarely been done. So they also don't expect that Jackson's going to go as far as to veto the bank bill. So there's lots of different political cartoons showing some of this and showing different views of Jackson. But we're going to go ahead and just skip on over to what Jackson decides to do with that bank bill. So much to everyone's surprise, Jackson defiantly vetoes the bank bill. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, it does mean that the national bank isn't going to be rechartered. It still has a few more years of life left, but it does mean the bank isn't going to be rechartered. Remember, Jackson believes in the president being a leader and the president doing what they want to do. And that's what he's doing here. I mentioned earlier that Jackson, his presidency represents a great expansion of presidential power, a big increase in presidential power. And the veto, especially, the veto of the bank bill, especially does that, because Jackson was utilizing the veto here because he wanted to. He was vetoing that bank bill, yes, because he thought the bank was unconstitutional, but mostly because he didn't like it. He didn't agree with it. He didn't think that it was helpful to the people he thought needed to be helped. So more than it being an issue of constitutionality here, he was acting on his own convictions. And that is unusual. That was different. That's a perception of the presidency that we might have now, that the president gets to act on what they think is right or wrong, to prioritize what they think needs to be prioritized, and gets to act on their own personal political convictions. But up until this time, that wasn't really the case. And Jackson is sort of creating that here. So it very much embodies an expansion of presidential power by arguing or utilizing the veto in this way. And Jackson used the veto more than just this one time. He used the veto actually more than any of his predecessors combined. So again, he believed that the president should leader and the president was free to act on their own conscience, that they were not just beholden to doing whatever Congress told them to do. So Jackson vetoes the bank bill, which causes a big fuss and a big expansion of presidential power. Those people that didn't support the bank see Jackson as a big hero. Those that did support it see him as a major villain and are very worried about the economic consequences of that. Jackson vetoed the bank bill and then wins re-election. And so Jackson then takes that to mean that people supported his veto of the bank, that they don't like the national bank, and that they are with him on the idea that the national bank is bad news and needs to be gotten rid of. Now, remember that that bank still has a couple of years of life left, but Jackson decides to try to get rid of it before that. He's going to kill it off even before the charter runs out, that vetoing the bank bill wasn't enough. So Jackson kills off the bank by removing the government's money from it. He has the government's deposits removed from the national bank, or rather he asked the Secretary of the Treasury to do that and deposit it into some other smaller state banks. And by doing this, this kills the bank, because without government money in there, now the bank has no money to loan out. It has no money which to do its business. It has no capital to actually function, and it goes bankrupt. It goes under. But we should realize how controversial this was. Jackson actually had to go through a couple of secretaries of the Treasury in order to do so. The first Secretary of the Treasury, when Jackson ordered him to remove the money, refused to do it. So I'm not doing that. Jackson fired him, and Jackson appointed somebody else. He refused to do it. Jackson fired him. Finally, on about the third one, he agreed to do it. So that just shows how controversial it was and how many people felt that Jackson was acting beyond his power, that he was exceeding the powers granted to him as president. And that's why Jackson is sometimes accused of acting like a dictator. You know, some people saw him as this great hero, this common man, you know, fighting for the people thing. Other people saw him as an absolute villain that was like a dictator and acting like a king. So Jackson does eventually kill off the bank, and the national bank is no more, and we will not see a return of a national banking system until early in the 20th century, actually. And as a result of this, something that we will see as an economic consequence is something known as the Panic of 1837. A panic, this is a word that was often used in the 18th and 19th centuries to describe what we would today call probably a recession, an economic downturn, okay, where the economy falls out, the economy takes a bad turn, it crashes, whatever you want to call that, resulting in businesses failing and banks failing and people being out of work and just a big economic recession or contraction. Because without the bank there to stabilize the economy, without the bank to provide capital and loans and those kind of things, businesses are going to go under. So supporters of the bank say, see, we told you so. You messed up with the bank. You messed up the finances, and now we're in an economic depression. Jackson actually argues, no, I told you so. I told you the bank was too powerful. To him, it was just proof that the bank was overly powerful and, had too much control over the economy and too much control over the nation's finances. So no more national bank. We will not see another one of those until, like I said, the 20th century, and that one has been in place ever since. But Jackson's presidency very much representing a big expansion of presidential power, particularly with the way he handles the national bank. So Jackson's an interesting character and a hero or a villain, depending on who you were.